Greetings, School of Lifers. Welcome to another business analysis webinar. This week, we're going to be talking about BA techniques. The BABOK lists 50 of them. We talked about a bunch of them last week when we talked about artifacts that can be created to aid in communication and clarity and understanding. Those were mostly visual, not all, but mostly. And in this case, we're going to cover a lot of other techniques. The BABOK list 50 will cover about 20 today. I have written blog posts about 42 of them so far, and there are a handful where I have stub slides at the end of this presentation that I will fill in as they get written. So, you know me, I've been doing simulation for a long time in a lot of different situations for a lot of different reasons, using a lot of different methods. By the way, there are embedded links in the slides here, which are implemented and hosted in the reveal.js framework. So be sure to find the slides on my website and click through to read the linked information, which provides much greater detail. To the degree that greater detail really exists. For a lot of these BA techniques, the BABOK doesn't really have much to say. The techniques are pretty straightforward. In some cases, there are more detail for others. And we covered that. All right, let's start with prioritization and backlog management. Really, you could think of these as two techniques, but the BABOK lists them together. You can see that one way the phases in my framework can be represented or organized or implemented is in this format in an Agile Scrum type environment, management environment. So you do the first three phases to generate backlog items. Then you pull them off the backlog to do design and implementation and test and acceptance and so on. And what the product owner and all the relevant stakeholders and participants do is progressively elaborate them and then figure out which ones are going to be worth during every time period, whether you call that a sprint or whatever. And the criteria for prioritization can be based on a lot of things. What the business needs, what stakeholders and participants need, technical dependencies, what resources you have available, and other things. Items in the backlog can be at different levels of maturity and completeness. So over time, you might put in a fairly general item in the backlog, and then you will break it down and elaborate it and clarify it and so on. And by the time things are actually worked on by the implementation and design teams, they should be pretty clear and standalone, not need a lot of further explanation. However, the relevant people then are in charge of the backlog items or responsible for defining them should be available to answer any questions and provide any information needed. Estimation is a very important technique. By the way, there are links at the bottom of all these slides to blog posts. You'll occasionally find information of other kind embedded in the actual write-up. So estimation is used to provide predictions of various kinds, usually related to iron triangle elements, time, money, and features, or quality or performance. The third one has a lot of different ways they can be defined by time and money, or the big one. The BABOK really only talks about time or money, but you can estimate anything. And there are a lot of different kinds of estimate. See the article for more detail. The most important thing to know is estimates are more accurate the more information you have. And the more you have an analogous situation you're basing your estimate off, the more accurate it's likely to be. So, if you're launching an entirely new product type into a market, you don't really know much about how it might work. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. But in other cases, you make estimations and predictions, and they might be way more accurate. For example, Costco knows how to analyze an area for demographics, income, living space, and so on. And they know pretty well what it takes to support a new store. So they don't generally fail when they open. Item tracking involves keeping track of work items and concepts throughout an engagement. They take a lot of forms. I talk about requirements, traceability matrices. Work items really appear in the implementation phase and beyond. Everything else is kind of developed out of discovery and data collection and design before then, although the process of identifying those can themselves be work items. Jira and Rally are often used to track items, but this can be done any way you like. Punch lists are common near the end of an engagement when there aren't that many items left. They're called gig lists, bug lists, and so on. there are as many tracking methods as you want to imagine, and there are a lot of different pieces of information that can be associated with each one. Lessons learned, you can learn things at any time during an engagement or through a course of work. You can learn about anything. So how you develop the solution, how you communicated with the customer and interacted, and how you worked within the team, what skills you need, what methods you used, and so on. And the standard sprint methodology includes lessons learned or the potential for recording and incorporating lessons learned at the end of every sprint in a couple different ways, but you can do them at the end of a project or a program or any phase or deliverable. And again, you can learn lessons about anything. And the key is ideally write them down or document them and save them. As a practical matter, they usually live on in the personal experience of the participants, which is maybe not always the most effective way to go, but that's how it generally works. Reviews happen all the time. They're basically involved with iterating within a phase. So you do discovery and document what you discovered. The discovery experts and SMEs review your documentation, and then you correct and fix and respond and continue iteratively doing that until everybody agrees you've got it right. Testing is a form of review, so reviewing is a general concept. And you review things also to keep work online in projects involving a lot of parallel efforts and where a lot of things have to be kept in sync. So this is a representation of an engagement using a safe framework. You've got multiple teams pulling from a shared backlog, on one or more teams operating out of their own backlogs, waterfall type process, and continuous or ad hoc fixes and development. And you want to make sure all the work on those is in sync, have the proper cross links if and when appropriate, and so on. And you need communication and review to make that happen. Acceptance and evaluation criteria are two aspects or two sides of the same coin. So acceptance criteria are about whether an item meets an identified need, and evaluation criteria are about which potential solution should be used, which is the best. So acceptance criteria kind of drive how things are either meet the needs identified and are germane to the work you're doing or don't. And they are often tracked through a requirements traceability matrix to make sure everything you're doing and adding actually addresses the identified problem and specific work requirements. So functional requirements are generally go, no go, and they're more easy to be judged objectively. Non-functional requirements are less so. So how do you say whether something is aesthetically pleasing or not, or matches some kind of color or design scheme that you've set up to go with your branding? Evaluation criteria can be very different. Sometimes you can figure out costs and benefits very directly when comparing different potential solutions you've developed to a problem, but sometimes you can't. And in those cases, if there are very different approaches in different potential solutions, you might come up with a hybrid weighted multiplicative system that gives different weights to different criteria according to what different individuals think might be most important. So this can get tricky, and eventually you have to use entrepreneurial judgment in cases where things are not well defined. And I have a link to a further discussion on that subject. Metrics and KPIs talk about how an operation or organization is performing, and they can be expressed in a lot of different ways. So, data and characteristics of various items that are being processed come in many forms, and they are often very important to the process. They drive decisions made within the process, but they don't all make good metrics or KPIs. What you want to do is choose really good ones and that are appropriate. So if you choose the wrong measure to guide your operations, you can really be led astray. And I talked about Goodhart's law. So there's a great story from the old Soviet Union. They used to establish metrics for production of various goods in tons. And they would do this for nails, for example. And it was harder to make fine roofing nails than it was to make big chunky nails. So shop managers not wanting to be sent to the gulag will make the nails that are easier to make. There's a joke where a guy meets his quota by making one giant nail, but that's a famous cartoon. And what would happen is they would frame buildings in the old Soviet Union, and they'd be able to put up the walls and so on. but then they would not have enough roofing nails to put the roofs on. So the buildings would just sit there and rot in the elements. And that's because there was no communication based on the price system to ensure that people went through the work to get things they needed and get things that were harder to produce. Metrics and KPIs can be simple. Many of the examples or types of them are up at the top, but they can also be very complex. When we did logistics simulations for aircraft maintenance, there was a very complex kind of synthetic calculation resulting in a value they called readiness. And it was a fairly low value expressed as a percentage, but even small variations in that value, and it was hard to move, had a pretty big potential impact on the process. So the key is to, as in all things, ensure there is good and detailed communication in all these situations. Moving on, we have benchmarking, which is about comparing what you're doing in the characteristics, processes, and goods and methods have compared to other things that are out there in industry. So, and a good example is I owned a Ford Taurus in 1986, the first year that car was made. It was the Motor Trend Car of the Year. And what the designers did was look at all the other cars in that segment and figure out how they were going to either match or beat different features. And one of the ways they did that I found endlessly fascinating was on the rear deck behind the back seat under the rear window, not windshield. There was a flat space between the speakers, and they actually, on one trim level, included a compartment there that actually closed, and I used to keep my manuals and things in there. So that was a really interesting touch. And they came up with that piece of design because they looked afresh at every element of the car to see what they could change or add or whatever. So benchmarking comes in many forms. Market analysis is less about individual situations and more about what the market will support, what your competitors are doing in a general sense, and so on. Balanced scorecard is the next couple of things I've never used, but that doesn't mean they aren't good. And keep in mind with these that the process of business analysis is as applicable to doing or analyzing the environment you're operating in and your company or organization as it is toward analyzing and developing solutions and thinking about how you're actually running your engagement. So it has a lot of facets. In this particular technique, we're analyzing the environment after a fashion or the organization in terms of financial, learning and growth, business process, and customers. And for each one of those, you look at objectives, what you're trying to do, measures, how you're keeping track of how well you're doing, targets, and initiatives, which is what are you actually doing to make these things better. So while I may not have done this exact thing in a cohesive way, I definitely looked at all the pieces. And a lot of these techniques are really formalized ways of getting you to look at a problem from many different angles. They are kind of forcing you to do what you should be doing anyway if you were being super diligent and formal. The business model canvas is very similar and looks at organizations based on 9 dimensions, which are listed here. I think this is more germane to higher level analysts or organizational offers or investors potentially. Comparing a bunch of companies, they might be doing benchmarking or market analysis. They may be looking at acquisitions or competitors or doing SWOT analyses. So a lot of these methodologies and techniques actually cross-link or cross-pollinate each other. Speaking of SWOT analysis, that stands for strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. So what you're trying to do is identify opportunities, which is chances to do good things and realize gains, and also you're comparing those against threats, which are opportunities where bad things could happen. And then you're also looking at your strengths and weaknesses. So you want to exploit your strengths and minimize or mitigate or overcome your weaknesses. And there is an actual another common technique that's called important versus urgent. And things are either more or less important and more or less urgent. And you want to concentrate on doing things that are important and urgent versus unimportant and non-urgent, even though those can be fairly easy, almost relaxing tasks to accomplish. You can do a lot of them, but not really attack meaningful work. So there's a book called Eat That Frog, which means get up and attack the hard things first. So this is an organized way to make you do things that might be hard but are necessary. Interviews involve one-on-one or discussions with small groups of people, and they involve the potential for very deep communication. You need really good communication skills. And I was, as I was thinking about this, and over the years I've been developing and thinking about my BA framework, I came to the idea that the primary flow of information or elicitation goes one way in the beginning of a process or engagement and the other way in the end. So in the beginning, you're interviewing or doing workshops or whatever with SMEs and participants from your customer, and it doesn't matter whether that customer is internal or external. What you're doing is eliciting needs and current state information from your customers. And then what you're doing in the latter half when you're proposing designs and doing implementations is you're actually presenting things to them that you've created and soliciting feedback. So you ask questions in the first half, they give you information, you document it, they give you feedback. In the end, in the back half of the process, you're giving them work products and ideas, and they're giving you feedback, and you'll potentially change what you're doing to meet their feedback or to respond to their feedback. I don't know that that's particularly important. It's just that I thought it was interesting. Focus groups involve or focus groups and workshops both involve getting together with larger groups of people than you would in interviews. In some ways, they're kind of the same or related. You're getting together to solicit information, but these two techniques are a little bit different. So the point of view of a focus group is to engage reaction to a particular thing, some policy change or methodology change or a current or a potential product. And workshops involve getting a bunch of people together to accomplish something more general. You can create almost any artifact or work product or what have you in a workshop, so they're more general. Surveys or questionnaires can be used to gain a potential lot of information for a lot of people in a fairly short period of time. They have well-known strengths and weaknesses, so a lot of media surveys you do are actually meant to make news and affect opinion and make opinion rather than understand or report on existing opinion. So there are a lot of ways you can do this. Make sure you use the right ones and apply them and conduct them honestly. work for these things goes in 3 to 5 phases. There's a lot to do in each phase, but just as a high level, you prepare for them and prepare the actual questions and range of responses, or leave it open-ended. You identify who you're going to distribute them to, and then you distribute them, and then you gather the responses, analyze them, and take action accordingly if appropriate. There are a ton of different kinds of observation. I list and discuss a bunch of them here. This is actually involved with a number of the other techniques. You often do these during discovery and data collection as part of conceptual modeling. I've done this a ton of different ways in my career. They may work slightly differently sometimes when doing engineering type work rather than purely business analysis type work. But at the end of the day, the actual type of analysis you're doing in order to solve problems effectively is more the same than different. Conceptual modeling is just about coming up with abstract representations of as is or to be states, and they can represent all or part of a system or solution. And I talk about concept modeling or conceptual modeling is really a core part of my framework. Brainstorming is basically getting a bunch of people together and coming up with as many ideas as possible. Actually, brainstorming can involve any number of people, including just yourself, right? And it's just a question of generating ideas. They can be done at any time. There are a lot of techniques that essentially amount to brainstorming, like the 5 whys. It can go forwards or backwards, so it can be responsive in the case of root cause analysis, or going forward to generate possibilities for design and implementation. The more knowledge you have and the more different viewpoints, the more ideas you'll be able to come up with. And ideally, you should be in an open environment that's supportive and just lets the ideas flow and let your mind go wherever without ruling anything out as stupid. When you identify a lot of possibilities, you can knock some of them out when you get into analysis. The point is to just think of everything that may be germane. Functional decomposition means breaking down any kind of work or any kind of system into its component parts to whatever degree is necessary. The more you know about an industry or organization or methodology, the more you'll be able to break stuff down. It'll be based on standard industry or organizational practice, but you also want to be able to bring your native intelligence and thought processes to it. And there are a lot of ways you can break things down. You can think about what you're trying to achieve. That's your decomposition objectives. The subjects of decomposition, which is what you're going to break down, the level of decomposition, which is how far you're going to go. For example, all these are examples of pieces of equipment my first engineering company manufactured and built into their turnkey mechanical pumping systems. So knowing about all these was always a good thing. And the level of decomposition usually went no farther, at least for me as a high-level process engineer, only concerned with pulp quality. I would stop decomposing a system at the level of the effects each machine or group of items like these centrifugal cleaners would have on the pulp. And I wouldn't go into the materials they're made of, the individual pieces of hardware, the nuts and bolts, and so on. That's a lower level of decomposition than I ever cared about. That said, in the organization, there were people that did care about those things. So the point is to do the appropriate work and break things down in a way that's germane to what you're doing. Go as far as you need, either up or down, but no farther. And then finally, it's how you represent the decomposition results. One thing you may want to do is think about how changes to every element might affect the process. So going back to the pulping example, this is a screw dewatering press. If I change the size of this or the strength of the screw threads or whatever, that might have an effect on how much water I can squeeze out of wood pulp. However, if I start thinking about the individual screws on this machine, then that probably wouldn't have much of an effect on the pulp. So you can think about it like an equation that has many terms. Think about each variable taking on values that are higher or lower, and think about what changes that may have on the result. Those are just ways to think about things. By the way, I saw an example of this in a paper mill that was many years old. It was probably 20 or 30 years old. And my boss suggested I take a picture of it, because in that instant, this nice steel windowed cover was missing, and they had set up two little shower rods and hung shower curtains to keep the water that was being squeezed out of the boat in place. He thought that was pretty funny, and we had this senior emeritus guy who had a zillion patents, who would think it would be funny. So I used to carry a ton of photo equipment to paper mills all over North America, and I took a picture and shared it with the guy, and he thought the whole thing was pretty funny. So mind maps are particular kinds of drawings that are meant to convey knowledge and organize thoughts. A lot of people define them only as variations on tree diagrams, which themselves can take on many forms, but as a practical matter, a lot of people call a lot of different things mind maps. When I first encountered the concept, um, I saw this guy. He was a ponytailed PhD from California, smart, creative, interesting guy. Um, had some crazy ideas about doing economic simulation, but that's another story. Anyway, he had this computer app that basically did mind maps, and he would always take his notes using an app that would build trees of various kinds, and he could cross-link concepts that were related. And I always thought that was what mind maps were. But I've seen people call a lot of different things mind maps, so we can be loosey goosey with this one. Use whatever method of note taking, information capture, and communication that works for you and your customers, and that's great. Prototyping involves creating something that allows the investigation of all or part of a prospective system. So, a prototype might range from anything from a drawing on a napkin in a restaurant to a fully functional aircraft. And you can think of a lot of prototype cars that you see at auto shows to express concepts and test market ideas and just play with things. And you can think of things you actually do experiments on. And they can be used for almost any purpose. Simulations are an important type of or class of prototype. For one of the companies I work for, we came up with a tagline that, and it was a variation of an idea I actually came up with. And it was, I think they trademarked it. It was along the lines of, we do it 1,000 times, so you do it right the first time. That was pretty fun. So a lot of times prototypes or throwaways. I know a guy that mocked up a potential mechanism for a walking beam furnace in a steel mill. They used a circular advancement motion to walk elongated pieces up a set of stairs, kind of. And he made that out of cardboard and some dowels. And there are a lot of fairly famous experimental aircraft, which are prototypes that are sitting around in museums, and I always enjoy seeing those. Data mining is a very big deal today. It's about processing large amounts of data to gain insights and support decisions. So you do this to describe the data to figure out what's going on in your processes or organization, or figure out what's going to happen. And there are a lot of ways you can think about these. There are top-down versus bottom-up methods, and supervised or unsupervised methods. And the way you do a project involving data is generally requirements, data preparation, and analysis, modeling, and deployment. So if you have an existing process which processes a lot of data to make a decision, you might incorporate some kind of machine learning or big data model. There are many possible techniques. For example, this drawing right here on the right shows under modeling techniques, decision trees, linear regression, neural networks, support sector machines, predictive scorecards, and a few examples. There are many. And you can incorporate that in that sub-mechanism into any process. When you're developing a big data model or some kind of machine learning thing, or AI quote unquote based mechanism, you want to take your available data and break it up into 3 sets. So the first one you actually use to build the model, and the second, third you use to verify the model, and then you can apply the model to the third set of data and all subsequently acquired data. And you have to hope that the data set is large enough and homogeneous enough to make sure the results make sense and are valid. So this is a huge field. There's way more going on in it than I can really describe here. So let's call it a day on this one. Scope modeling, and I think this is the end for today, involves figuring out what aspects of a solution or system we're going to consider or not consider. And the more you understand the system, the better you can make these decisions about what to include or not. You should document any decisions you make about why you did or did not include something. There are a lot of reasons for each. You can look at the relative effects of each process or contributor through a process of sensitivity analysis is one way to determine whether things should be in or out of scope. And sometimes you're not thinking about whether something is in or out of the larger scope but which subsystem it's between. You want to have things together that make logical sense, and boundaries and interfaces between them that separate things out into logical self-contained groups. If you imagine drawing a diagram of an entire factory, for example, there may be one subsection of it that does one particular thing, and you may draw a scope boundary around that and just look at that. Certainly, when we did nuclear power plant models, there were 50 different or more recognized subsystems within the plant, and drawing boundaries between them was important. So what I've done, there are a handful of additional techniques I haven't written blog posts for yet. I plugged 42 out of the 50 many I covered last week. I covered the rest this week. I will expound on these in the future in some way. So be sure to come back and check out these slides as hosted on my website. Again, this is the TWSL series of webinars. This is lecture 14, and I think we're good for today. All right, we have one participant who has joined us too. How are you gentlemen today?
Very good.
Doing good.
Robert, let's see, in scoring, what are you calling it? When you want to make a metric out of several variables, are you aware of, are there any accepted systematic ways to evaluate how much each variable should contribute? Because I find that people over systematize, or people easily have too much faith in a kind of ad hoc system, especially people who are not trained as engineers. They overestimate how much objectivity is in there when it's really just spitting back to them whatever weighting they came up with. Is there any approach? Are there approaches to that are systematic at all?
I don't think there are, and I don't think there can be. Those processes are necessarily ad hoc. So one example when I discussed this concept I often used was Rand McNally in the early to mid 80s came up with the Places Rated Almanac, which rated the largest 350 metro areas in the U.S. And they evaluated them based on 9 criteria like education, healthcare, weather, and the metric they used was average temperature, and they chose 65 degrees as being the ideal range. So by that metric, Phoenix would look bad and Anchorage wouldn't look bad, but Pittsburgh and San Francisco would look good, and they both rated very highly. Yeah, but that 65 as an average was problematic itself. So San Francisco might be roughly 65 degrees almost all year round. If Pittsburgh can be 90 in the summer and 20 in the winter, and Grand Lebanon in kind of snowy and slushy, not a lot of fun. So not every metric is the same. And I think they had a table in the back, and that allowed you to assign weightings on the scores in the individual 9 areas. So you could, what they did was evenly weighted all 9 aspects, right? And they came up with scores. So San Francisco did really well. Pittsburgh, to everybody's shock and amazement, finished #1. And that was probably good marketing for the ball. They actually may have goose the numbers to get that result just because it went against expectations. And Knoxville, Tennessee finished 9th. That's a nice place, but not every place in Tennessee is. So there, I mean, everybody has their biases. If I was looking at places to live, I'm in Orlando. I don't particularly care for Orlando, but it's near St. Pete that I do care for. And there's a factor that makes me appreciate this area, which is my grandparents lived here. Now, how is that going to fit in a weighting system? If you're young, you might not care about healthcare that much, but if you're old, you might. If you're old, you might not care about education, but if you're young, and especially if you have kids, you might. So those things are inevitably and necessarily subjective. And all you can do is understand your biases in your inputs, discuss them and document them, and make sure you're transparent.
Yeah, and it probably helps to, and you can, when you've picked a metric, you can calibrate it on, if you have if you know that San Francisco is the best, you can at least make sure that your system makes San Francisco the winner, right? But obviously you're begging the question there. But
Yeah, and
you should. I
San
mean, you should design
Francisco,
it to give you
yeah,
the right answer that you want.
San Francisco in 1983 may be a very, very different place in many ways than San Francisco in 2023, which in some ways might be hell on earth, right? So,
Yep.
so again, transparency and open communication in all things. Okay. Seeing no further questions or commentary, thank you for joining as always. And we'll go ahead and post this like we always do.